Hey, welcome to another episode of GeekOutdoors.com. If you spent any time watching my channel, you know how much of a Linux lover and Linux fanboy that I am, especially when it comes to Linux Mint. But a while back, I did do an episode where I talked about my top 5 reasons why you shouldn't use Linux. Now, if you've not seen that episode, I'll leave it in the description area below. And today I'm doing a follow-up to it, and I'm going to be talking about the top 5 Linux problems that most people will commonly encounter. And the reason I'm doing this is because I don't want to give the impression to brand new users of Linux that there are no issues and that you will never ever go back to Microsoft Windows or Apple Mac. The reality is there are issues, and the reality is not everything's perfect. Okay, so starting with number 5 is operating system bugs. Okay, pretty much every single operating system has bugs, okay, and problems. But the difference with Linux versus, say, a Microsoft Windows or an Apple Mac is that since the Linux operating system is open source and it's based upon a community driven software, operating system bugs might not always be fixed. For example, I've had instances where my Wi-Fi was not working, okay? Or maybe the computer would not go to sleep, it wouldn't suspend, or sometimes I couldn't hibernate it. And on some versions of Linux, you might not ever get a fix for that operating system bug. And that's the reality of it. Now, for systems like Microsoft Windows and Apple Mac, a lot of times, since it is a paid operating system and they have quite a large team to support it, normally operating system bugs are fixed. Okay. Now, people who have been using Linux a long time, they know that the community is amazing, which I really do think that they are. And a lot of times bugs do get fixed. But just realize that not every single bug will be fixed, and not every single bug will be fixed for your version of Linux. Okay. And that's the number 5 problem that you'll face. The number 4 problem is very similar to that, and that is broken updates. Okay. Now, I think anybody who's used an operating system has experienced updates that will break your operating system or cause problems. Okay. And normally it'll roll back, but sometimes it doesn't actually fix the problem, and sometimes you can actually break it. Okay. And in this case, it can definitely happen. Okay. And let me give you an example. I had an update come, which is this grub2 sign. This is actually the bootloader that boots your operating system. And when I updated this on my desktop Linux Mint, it actually broke my operating system, and I could not boot into my Linux operating system. That is bad. However, when I updated with this same update on my laptops, I had no problems. Okay, so you are definitely going to run into issues like that. And honestly, there's really no way around that, because whenever you buy a Windows computer or an Apple Mac computer, they made sure everything has worked with that hardware. Okay, whereas in the whole Linux world, since it is open source and since there's millions and billions of different configurations of hardware, not everything's going to work. And sometimes whenever they release an update, it can break something, especially if it's a beta version. So what I recommend a lot of people do to mitigate that is, on your preferences, make sure that you only update level 1, no impact at all. You could go there to your preferences, or you could also select the update policy and use that. Okay, but just to be safe, only update level 1. Okay, but that doesn't mean that you can have updates that will break your system. Okay, and so that is a real thing. I have had updates just like what I mentioned with that one before that have really messed up my operating system. Okay, and especially when there's something like kernel updates that could really mess up your system. And so what I really recommend is, with any operating system, you back everything up regularly. Okay, but as I mentioned a little bit earlier, very similar to the whole OS bugs, this is an open source project, and so there's potential that with so many different devices, and also, once again, this is an open source community, sometimes these things might break on your system. Okay, I will say things have gotten a lot better over time versus when I first started using Linux. And so it doesn't happen very often, but just as the example I just showed you here, this one actually messed up my operating system. Okay. And so that is something that you might encounter. And so always back up your system. Okay. So that's the number 4 problem that you could have. The third problem is software support. And what I mean is software not being available on your operating system. Okay, now I have mentioned this on my other video where things like Adobe, Apple Final Cut Pro, they will not be available on Linux. But there are literally thousands of other software that will not be available on this platform versus say something like Windows where everything is made for it. Okay, so if you enjoy using a specific type of software on your operating system, whether it's Windows or Mac, a lot of times just expect that those might not be available in Linux. Okay, now I have mentioned this before that a lot of what we do is on our browsers now. So for some people, or for a lot of people, that might not be a problem. But there's still many people who have software that they actually install on their operating system that will not be available in Linux. And this could be a real issue if you have software that you use on a daily basis that will not simply be available in Linux. And so the software support is not there. And so very similar to the whole model of the paid operating system versus the open source is that there's not financial incentive to produce software for this operating system, okay, specifically Linux as a desktop. And so that is something that I think will throw off a lot of people whenever they use Linux, because they're probably wondering why their favorite software is not available on Linux. Okay, so that is actually the number 3 problem that you will face. Okay, so the number 2 problem is hardware incompatibilities. Okay, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Whenever you buy a Windows machine or Mac machine, they have made sure that the operating system is compatible with that hardware. For example, say you bought a Windows laptop and it had touchscreen capability and it had touchscreen software to go along with it. Now, if you were to put the Linux operating system on that, you might not be able to use those features anymore because the hardware was built with compatibility for Windows in mind. Okay, and so things more than likely would just not work anymore. And so whatever features that you paid for hardware wise for that laptop, they might no longer work. And that is definitely a problem for a lot of people who spend a lot of money on their computers and they are expecting everything to just work, and it doesn't work. Okay, which leads me to my number 1 problem that you'll face on this is lack of drivers. And it's tied to hardware incompatibilities, but it goes even further than that, because when I talk about hardware incompatibilities, I'm talking about the hardware that you have on your computer right now. But when I'm talking about lack of drivers, I'm also talking about hardware that you could purchase to extend your computer. Okay, things like your graphics cards, which is a huge problem, or things like printers. Okay, and there are open source printer drivers that you can use, but a lot of times they don't have all the features that should come with your printer, that you can use all the functionality. Okay, so a lot of times when you buy a printer, you will actually get drivers that go along with it that you can use all the different hardware functionality. Okay, and then if you think about more complex things like 3D printers, or maybe hardware VR devices, your HTC Vive, your Oculus Rift, whatever other VR devices that come out in the future, more than likely they're going to be built with Windows in mind. So the drivers are going to be there for it. Whereas for a Linux desktop operating system, it might not be there. Okay, or it might have some type of open source driver that once again might not give you all the features. Okay, or if you had other hardware devices, like maybe smart devices that you had, or maybe you had like features, that drivers that will allow you to talk to other different hardware, but it's not built for Linux. Okay, and so that is I think the number one problem that I think a Linux user will face is that, a lot of times when you buy your computer, you just kind of expect everything to work with each other. Okay, and without the support from the hardware and software manufacturers, you're not going to get that on the Linux desktop operating system, even though it is capable of handling that. And so those are the top 5 common Linux problems that I think most users will face. First and foremost, operating system bugs. That's number 5. Number 4, broken updates. Number 3, software support or lack of software support. Number 2, hardware incompatibilities. And the number 1 common problem is lack of drivers. So I hope that these top 5 Linux problems will give people who are brand new to Linux a real world idea of what you're gonna have to face when you are using Linux, but also some things that you might have to learn, just as I did, learn how to work around them, okay, or learn about other alternatives to using them, okay. Now, some things like drivers, that's still pain, okay, but like I said, it has gotten so much better since I first started using Linux as a desktop 10 years ago. Like, I don't have as many driver issues. Before, I had a lot of driver issues, but they're still there. Like, for example, my GPU, my AMD RX 470, I have some AMD drivers, but they're not the latest and greatest, and I can't use a lot of the features, like the brand new drivers are AMD Catalyst, okay? Or, if I'm thinking about getting a VR device, as I mentioned earlier, or if I want a 3D printer, I would definitely have some issues, and more than likely, I might have to get a Windows operating system in order to get everything to work. Okay, and so I hope that helps, and I hope that gives people an idea that the things that that they'll encounter when using Linux, and that just to be confident knowing that you can figure it out, and that there's also a community of people, not only on the internet but especially on YouTube, that is ready to help where possible, and that will make videos like these. And so those are it. And if you actually had any thoughts on any other common Linux problems that you face, be sure to leave it in the comments area below. And as always, if you did get value out of these videos, leave a like and subscribe. And if you wanted to support my channel further, you could do that at patreon.com/Geek Outdoors. Thanks for checking out this episode. And as always, if you like these videos, be sure to click on the subscribe button. And for full written content, audio content, and additional geek stuff, head over to geekoutdoors.com, and I'll see you outdoors on the very next episode.